Hello everybody and welcome to this video on openings. We're going to be looking at the Grunfeld Defence for black. It's a very sharp counter-attacking tactical game, and there are lots and lots of sidelines. This video might be quite long, dealing with all the possibilities. The game generally starts d4, knight f6, c4, g6. And you might be thinking that black is just going to quietly fianchetto the bishop on g7, or play d6 going into a king's Indian, or do a double fianchetto. But black's plan is to play d5, challenging in the centre very soon. And before we go right onto the main line that is usually played, white does have a few options if he either wants to prevent d5 or knows the other person likes the Grunfeld, or just plays wacky sidelines. The first move is d5, trying to gain early space. And here, black can get a fantastic game with kind of transposing into a type of Benoni system, a Benko gambit, with b5 takes, a6 takes, c6 takes, and now black finally does some capturing with knight takes. And what's going to happen here is that white has 7 pawns, black only has 5, but the a6 pawn can't be saved. So white will be a pawn up, but black has a massive lead in development, just because white's made about 6 pawn moves in a row. So the position could go e3. I mean, why not move another pawn? And black doesn't need to take on a6 immediately. Play bishop g7, knight f3, castle. And white really is waiting for the bishop on f1 to move, so that when it does, then black can take on a6. And if white wants to exchange, they'll have moved their bishop twice to do a move they could have done in one go. So if bishop e2, bishop takes a6. And after castles, knight e4, for example, black has a very good game here. Now, I would play this as black, because I don't think white is going to be able to easily prove that their pawn is actually sort of indicating that they're ahead. So that's the first sideline. Again, d5 is quite rare, but that was just quite a nice system to prove black had a good game. Before we do the main line, there's bishop g5 going into a kind of Trompovsky. And here the bishop's threatening to take the knight and give black double pawns. So knight e4 is most common. Bishop f4. And now this idea, I met a player who did this a lot in blitz games and highly recommended playing this. c5 to challenge on the dark squares. And the bishop's coming to g7 for black, and that would mean the diagonal would be opened up a lot if white took on c5. So quite common here is d5, but then bishop g7 is fantastic. And after a move like knight d2, queen a5, queen c2, f5, I think black here is still doing very well, and I would hesitate to say that white has any advantage at all. And the other move is queen c2, but then queen a5 check can be played anyway. And we almost transpose with this line. The only difference is white hasn't played d5 yet, but black still has a good game. Okay, so that's the bishop g5 line, and just before we do the main Grunfeld, white may try and delay it with knight f3. So here, black's idea of playing d5 can be a little bit hasty, because after white takes, black takes with the knight, then e4 can be played with the black knight having to move to b6, and that can be a little bit restraining for black. So you have two options here. You can either play what's sometimes called the solid Grunfeld with c6, and the idea here is to play d5 and then recapture with the pawn. But I wouldn't recommend this, only for personal preference. I mean, it's not bad or a mistake or anything like that, but it reminds me too much of the Slav, and white can often get a position that's very similar to the Slav, or basically straight out of the opening. The only real difference is that black will have fianchettoed the bishop on g7 instead of playing pawn e6 at a later date to allow the bishop to come to e7 or d6. And I can't help feeling that the bishop on g7 won't be as useful. White can play pawn e3 and have a pawn chain, creating a kind of brick wall, stopping black's bishop being very useful. So after a few moves like this, for example, we practically have a line straight out of the Slav, just without g6 being played, and e6 might have been played instead, which I feel is still more useful. So I think that black has a slightly inferior Slav. But again, this is just me. There are certainly masters who would disagree with me. But again, I just don't like it. So that's the solid Grunfeld. But the main move, if you really want a true Grunfeld, is bishop g7, because that move's going to be played anyway, and white's knight f3 is usually inserted in the Grunfeld, so it will still probably transpose into the main line, because here, what move can white really play? If they are desperately trying to avoid the Grunfeld, they might play bishop g5 or bishop f4. But you could if bishop f4, you could still play d5. Bishop g5, you have knight e4 again, transposing. And I don't think e3 is very strong, because it just locks your bishop in behind the pawn chain. So I think that the sort of best move for white does just transpose with knight c3. Like this. So here, whoops. Yeah, after knight c3, black can now play the move they've wanted to, d5. And again, there are still options for white. There are quite a lot of choices in this opening. The main line is bishop g5 when the moves knight f3 and bishop g7 have been inserted. But there are also other moves. But this one's the only independent line that I could find. So knight e4, c takes, knight g5, knight takes, e6. And again, this is the only slightly independent line that doesn't just transpose into the main line with the moves knight f3, bishop g7 added. So after, say, queen d2 protecting the knight on g5, h6, knight f3, pawn takes. And black has a pleasant game again. Both sides have an easy setup with e3, castles. b4 can be played to try and create a space advantage for white, but again, black has a very simple time setting up here with a move like bishop e6, bishop e2, knight d7, castles, c6. I think chances are about even here. So, going into the absolute main line, the one you're probably going to encounter a lot, the absolute main move is knight c3. And now d5. So we don't play bishop g7 here because otherwise white would have e4, which would cut out our idea of d5. So again, here there are options. Again, knight f3, bishop g7 would lead to the position I've just shown. So takes is the main move, and black recaptures. And here there are two main options again. Knight takes knight, queen takes is just not so good for white because the queen would be developed. So g3 can be played for white trying to fianchetto and put pressure along the dark squares. But I don't think this is very challenging because bishop g7, bishop g2, black can create their own pressure faster than white can with knight takes c3, pawn takes, and c5. So as usual in the main lines of the Grunfeld, black's pressure is going to be against the dark squares, particularly on d4. And it's mainly a game where black is attacking the centre and white is occupying it. So after a move like knight f3, knight c6, everything is being centered along on d4. And I have to thank the Grandmaster Repertoire series of books because I was looking at this line and I'd considered d5 for white as being very interesting because I didn't think bishop takes c3 was that strong, as bishop d2, bishop takes rook, queen takes rook would be an interesting exchange sacrifice. But in Grandmaster Repertoire, the move knight b4 was one I hadn't really considered, and it does seem to be very strong for black. The only real challenging move is a pawn taking the knight, as both c3 and d5 are under attack, and white can't defend both. So takes, bishop takes rook, pawn takes pawn, queen a5 check. And don't play queen d2, otherwise bishop c3 will win a queen. So bishop d2, queen takes a2. So black is up the exchange and still has the two bishops, and white has central control with the two pawns. So this is going to be a very double-edged game here, but I think black should at least have enough to draw this. I would say that black is winning, being the exchange up, but maybe white does have enough compensation to perhaps escape with a draw. But I like that line. So d5 isn't very good for white because it's basically white's best case scenario is drawing. So the main move is castling in this fianchetto sort of sideline / main line. Takes, 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 and rook b1 does add some pressure, and I think it's best for black not to just try and grimly hold on to the pawn. Let it go and just keep up in development, and black should be okay. After a move like castling, bishop e3, queen c4, bishop takes, rook takes, queen takes, rook takes. I still think black is winning here, or at least better, because the a pawn is going to be a very strong passer, whereas white's kingside majority is a lot harder to win with, because it's going to take a long time to push the pawn up, support it with other pawns, and slowly exchange off. So again, I think black has a slightly better game here, but perhaps it's quite drawish as well. It's going to be hard for black to win, but I do feel they have the chances. So In the Fianchetto system, I don't think black has any real problems. So the most commonly played move after d5 pawn takes, knight takes is e4. So now we get to the absolute main line. About 90% of games in the Grunfeld go down this path. So black's retreating move, knight b6, I think is just bad. After, say, knight f3 or bishop e3, bishop e2, white's kind of lead in terms of development and central control is really going to tell. So I think black has to take. White takes. And again, there are a lot of theorists who say that c5 is better for black than the move bishop g7, but often the games just transpose to the same thing, because bishop g7 and c5 are often played one after the other. So bishop g7 allows castling to be played, so I think in principle it's a better move. Also, c6 might be a good move if bishop b5 check, for example. So again, there's quite a lot of options for white. We'll have a look at bishop c4, c5. So first time we've seen bishop g7 and c5 follow each other. So again, in the main line of the Grunfeld, again, it's all about d4. It's all about who controls d4 and whether white has enough to control it, or if black's pressure is going to tell. So knight e2. Knight f3 is not as strong, because bishop g4 would pin the knight, and that might then be enough for black to have a lot of counterplay due to the knight no longer controlling d4. So knight c6, bishop e3, castles, castles. And here we could get to a very theoretical line. There's been tons of theory on this. So I like to sidestep it a bit with, after queen c7 and rook c1, the theoretical line goes rook d8. And this is where you need tons and tons of theory. You need to know a lot of sidelines. So I am lazy, and I think this move is just as good. I play b6. Allowing the bishop to come to b7 if possible. Also, perhaps I could even reroute the knight to d6 by playing knight a5, b7, d6. It also just guards the pawn on c5 here. And it would be quite dangerous for white to take the pawn, because after takes, takes, bishop takes, knight a5 would be pretty good for black, as both bishops would be on the line of the queen, and that could spell disaster. So queen d2 is probably the most commonly played move. It's the most common move I found, anyway, while researching this. And the idea is just to develop the queen, connect the rooks, so rook fd1 could be played, and also it sets up the queen and bishop battery on h6. So white will want to trade off black's very strong, influential bishop for white's less significant counterpart. Bishop b7, so double Fianchetto, and it pressurizes the center and connects the rooks as well. Bishop h6, and I don't think black needs to worry too much, because while white's been doing this battery, black gets in a lot of developing moves. So rook a d8 is probably a little bit stronger than rook f d8, because f7 could become a target in future, as well as a potential opening up of the e-file for black with moves like e6 or e5. So you might want the rook on f8 to go to e8 at some future point. Bishop takes, king takes, and here I would give it I'd evaluate this position as being level. I think that while white has a very small space advantage with the pawns, he's not really, well, the player with white isn't really threatening that much. And black can just huddle down and be extremely solid, or try and go for broke and double on the d file, or attack in some other way. So black hasn't really had to play the role of being a very defensive player here, and nor does black need to do that at the moment. But black still has the choice of switching strategies and just hunkering down, and white probably doesn't have enough to win here. So that's the bishop c4 line in the Grunfeld. Again, I know there's so many possibilities in this opening. So instead of bishop c4, how about bishop e3? So it's actually targeting d4 before there's that much pressure exerted, so that white will always have enough guarding d4 and can then choose how to develop the rest of the pieces. So again, c5 kind of needs to be played in this opening. Queen d2 is not that common, but it does cut out one motif, which is black taking on d4, white recapturing of the pawn, and then queen a5 check, which can interrupt the coordination of white's forces. So queen d2 isn't the only move, but I think it's the only independent move after bishop e3. A move like knight f3 will just transpose to a line we'll look at in a little while. So again, the idea is the queen and bishop battery, potentially. And after, the best move I think is just taking. And now, knight c6. So again, white is being attacked on d4 by 3 pieces and only has 2 defenders. So a move like bishop b5 I think is the strongest move here. Rook d1 is also playable, but I somehow feel it's not as effective because the rook might be better placed on c1 or b1 in the future, so you'd have to move the rook twice. Bishop d7, knight e2, and after a6, white could play bishop d3, which would keep the pieces on, but again, black could just castle or play a move like e6 or e5, and white's advantage is very negligible. So bishop takes, knight, bishop takes. Again, d5 can't yet be played because of the rook on a1 being attacked. So f3 guards the e4 pawn. Castles, castles. And perhaps bishop b5, rook f d1. And I think this is, again, a suggestion from the Grandmaster Repertoire series of books, so their edition on the Grunfeld, which I vaguely remember. I think it was bishop c4 with the idea of playing b5. And after, say, rook a c1, rook c8, d5 is probably the best move because it completes the pawn chain going from g2 to now d5 and gives the d4 square for the pieces, maybe the bishop to trade off. b5, and I still think that black has equality here because of the 2-to-1 on the queen side, whereas white's pawn majority on the king side is still quite difficult to push up the board. As long as black doesn't do anything silly like play e5, giving white a protected passed pawn, I think black has an easier time of it. So that was the bishop e3 line. Finally, the main move of the main line is knight f3. This is quite flexible. There are plenty of systems and transpositions here, so it's going to be incredibly hard for me to cover all of them, and I'm not sure I'm going to try because there's so much flexibility. But for an overview, c5, rook b1, so this gives the line independent value, and a move like bishop e3 would just transpose into a similar line to the one we've already seen. So rook b1 pressurizes the b file, and this is seen as one of the most challenging lines against the Grunfeld. So you need to know how to handle it as black. And simple development is what I would suggest here. Don't be too panicked about white's pressure. You're the one meant to be doing the pressurizing. So just, play it safe, castle, bishop e2. So again, keeping options open, white can now castle. Takes, and white needs to take with the pawn to keep the pawn structure good. Queen a5 check can be very annoying. Bishop d2. Queen d2 isn't as challenging for black. With the trade of queens, black has fewer pieces to pressurize the white center. So black probably wouldn't. Sorry, what was I saying? Sorry. White doesn't have enough pieces to defend the center because black's moves like knight c6, bishop g4, rook fd8 are going to attack d4 a lot. So white needs a lot of pieces to do the defense. So bishop d2, queen takes a2, castles. So okay, you've won a pawn as black, but try not to hold on to it too much by keeping the bishop on c8 at home. The b7 pawn isn't a huge deal, and your development is far more important. So bishop g4 threatens bishop takes f3, and then black could take on d4. So bishop g5 is a very common move, defending d4 with the queen. And here, I think I like this move, h6, which is very often played. And bishop takes e7, while looking like the obvious move, is clearly not the strongest because rook e8 puts the black rook on a very active square, skewers the bishop to the pawn, and even if you played rook takes b7, a move like knight c6 or knight d7 would just continue to develop for black, and I think black would actually be at the very least level, but I would evaluate it as being better for black. So bishop back to e3 is quite a sensible move. It's provoked the weakness on h6, so maybe queen c1 or queen d2 could be played for attacking h6. Knight c6, so again, let the pawn go, just develop. And here, I'll end the line here, but it's still very complicated, so there's a lot of analysis on this opening. But I think that white doesn't have enough compensation to really prove that white's better, because all white's doing is playing catch-up here with rook takes b7, and then a move like e6 could be played, bishop takes f3 could be played, and then rook d8 hitting the pawn on d4. So I would say black is at least equal, if not better. So I hope you like this video on the Grunfeld Defence. I might do another video on the Grunfeld in the middle game, sort of exploring how these positions evolve. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.